started with a sound most of us ignore. Not the alarm itself, but what came after. At precisely 6:05 a.m., in a narrow apartment above the Tiber River, Ethan woke up not to a jarring buzz or vibrating phone, but to something far more unsettling: the silence of his own mind. It was the kind of quiet that felt like standing on the edge of a cliff in your own life. No noise, no distractions, no excuses. Just the question, what am I building today? And worse, what if today turns out exactly like yesterday? That morning didn't begin with coffee or a scroll through social media. It began with a decision. One that would fracture his old identity like glass. Because the truth hit him harder than any alarm ever could. He had been waking up every day without actually waking up. You see, Ethan had lived in Rome for over a year, surrounded by centuries of deliberate architecture, breathtaking ruins, and stories carved in stone. And yet, he had never once considered that his own days, his actions, his routines, his reactions, were architecture too. His time had become accidental, reactive, weak. That realization didn't whisper to him, it screamed. And here's the part no one wants to admit. Most of us live on autopilot. We don't wake up, we come to. We stumble out of bed. We slam caffeine. We survive. But deep down, we feel it, that fog, that dissonance, that subtle ache, that tells us something's off. That we are drifting instead of designing. That we are reacting instead of responding. That we are existing instead of choosing. Ethan didn't want that life anymore. That morning, in the city where emperors once ruled, he decided to become something far rarer than a ruler. He decided to become a master of himself, of his emotions, of his choices, a stoic not by words, but by structure. He stood at his window and let the Roman dawn touch his face. No phone, no noise, just the first warm beams of sunlight grazing ancient rooftops and whispering, "Start again." He didn't just look out over the city, he studied it, because everything in Rome, every column, every arch, every cobblestone, was placed with intention. And he knew, so must my day be. Before the world could pull at him, he turned inward. He began his daily ritual, not because it was trendy, but because it was armor. He scribbled 3 lines in a black notebook. What obstacles might I face today? How will I respond with virtue, not impulse? What am I deeply grateful for? He didn't rush, he didn't fake it. He wrote with precision, like a craftsman shaping stone. His answers were raw. He expected ego-triggering emails. He anticipated delays. He foresaw doubts. And he made a plan not to control events, but to control himself. Then came the breath work. 4 seconds in, 2-second hold, 6 seconds out. He visualized the day ahead like a general plotting a campaign. Not every detail, just the pressure points, the moments where the old Ethan might have reacted emotionally. And the new Ethan would choose to pause. He followed it with movement, nothing fancy. Push-ups, squats, wall sits. It wasn't about building muscle. It was about building resolve. Each rep was a reminder. I show up. I don't wait for motivation. I command it. By 6:45 a.m., the city was waking. Scooters buzzed. Street vendors clanged. Metal gates open. Rome was returning to motion. But Ethan was already ahead of it. Not because he was faster, but because he had chosen to lead himself. He closed his notebook. He poured a single espresso. He stood on the balcony overlooking Piazza Navona and said out loud to himself, "Today, I build peace. Today, I live on purpose." And right there before, the emails, the meetings, the algorithms, the triggers, he had already won the day. If you felt something shifting you while hearing this, don't ignore it. That's the voice you've buried. That's the silence worth listening to, because your days are architecture, and you're either building a fortress or a ruin. If this message resonates with you, subscribe to the channel and support the journey. It's what keeps these stories alive and helps us build more blueprints for living with clarity, courage, and calm, Now, let's make this interactive. I want to hear from you. When you wake up in the morning, what's the first thing you do? A. Grab your phone and scroll. B. Sit still and check in with yourself. Drop your answer in the comments. A or B, your response helps us shape future content and build a more intentional community. By mid-morning, the rhythm of Ethan's day had found its pace. Rome was alive outside his apartment window, with the usual hum of scooters and distant church bells, adding color to the quiet focus within. His first design sprint had gone smoothly. His espresso had sharpened his attention, and for a brief moment, everything felt like it was in control. Then it came, a new email notification. Subject line, app feature concerns, urgent. He read it once, then again. The words were professional, but cold. One of the board members from their Boston-based client had questioned a central design decision. The tone was clinical, but laced with underlying tension. What made Ethan's chest tighten wasn't just the critique itself, but the implication that his judgment wasn't trusted, that his work might be misunderstood. He felt the heat rise, that familiar flicker of defensiveness. His hands hovered above the keyboard, ready to type a detailed explanation to defend his choice, to reassert his value. But then something deeper stopped him. It wasn't hesitation. It was awareness. He sat back in his chair and closed his eyes. In that stillness, the words of Marcus Aurelius surfaced in his mind, like a steady hand on his shoulder. If you are distressed by anything external, the pain is not due to the thing itself, but to your estimate of it. And this you have the power to revoke. It wasn't the email causing his stress. It was his interpretation. His ego had heard threat. His pride had heard insult. But neither had read with reason. He stood up and walked to the open window. The Roman light poured in, soft but unwavering. The sounds of the street below reminded him that life continued, indifferent to his momentary agitation. He took 3 slow breaths, anchoring his awareness back into the present. Then he asked himself the question that had become his emotional reset. Is this within my control? The answer was clear. He couldn't control the client's tone, or their assumptions, or how quickly they understood his perspective. But he could control how he responded. He could choose clarity over defensiveness, composure over impulse. When he returned to his desk, he no longer felt the urgency to be right. Instead, he focused on being useful. He opened the blank reply and began with a sentence that had no sharp edges. Thank you for your feedback. I understand how essential this feature is to your team's vision, and I'm here to help refine it. By the time he hit send, the emotion that had originally stirred him had dissolved. In its place was a calm sense of control, not over the situation, but over himself. Building emotional resilience isn't dramatic. It rarely involves grand gestures or cinematic moments. It's built in quiet, in the space between stimulus and response. It's built in the second you choose not to react out of fear, but to respond from clarity. In the past, Ethan might have spiraled into resentment or doubt. He might have let that single email poison the rest of his day. But now, he saw each moment of friction as a training ground, a place to practice the discipline of restraint. To reinforce this habit, he had developed a simple technique. Whenever he felt triggered, he tapped his thumb to his index finger. A small gesture, barely noticeable, but it was his cue, a physical reminder to pause, breathe, and assess. It was his anchor in emotional storms. That morning's conflict passed. The client replied with appreciation for the thoughtful response. But even if they hadn't, it wouldn't have changed Ethan's victory, because the real triumph was internal. He had stayed composed. He had chosen virtue. There's a false belief that resilience is about never feeling shaken. But real resilience is being shaken and not collapsing. It is having your emotions stirred, but not ruled by them. It is recognizing that your first instinct isn't always your highest self, and that strength is found in the space where you step back and decide. Again, most people live at the mercy of external circumstances. A rude email, a partner's bad mood, a missed train, and with each incident, their emotional stability crumbles just a little more. Ethan used to be one of them, until he began to see each of these moments as invitations to build his inner fortress, brick by brick, pause by pause, choice by choice, and in that way, emotional resilience is no longer just a concept. It becomes a practice, a way of being, a daily reminder that while the world may throw wind and fire your way, the strength of your inner structure determines whether you bend or burn. That morning in Rome, with nothing more than breath, awareness, and principle, Ethan had reinforced his walls. Not to keep the world out, but to keep his values in, because in the end, a Stoic doesn't avoid storms. He learns to stand in them without being moved. By early afternoon, the sun over Rome was harsh and unforgiving, casting sharp shadows across the cobbled alleyways below Ethan's apartment. Inside, his workspace was cool, shaded, and quiet. The light from his monitor reflected off his focused eyes. His fingers moved steadily across the keyboard as he worked on refining the interface of a mobile app designed to help stroke survivors regain mobility and confidence in their daily routines. Each icon, each gesture, each line of code was part of something larger than pixels and performance metrics. It wasn't always like this. There was a time when Ethan saw work as a necessity, a means to an end, something to be endured until the weekend arrived or until a better opportunity knocked. Deadlines felt like pressure. Tasks felt meaningless. Effort felt invisible. But all of that changed when he began viewing his work not as an obligation, but as a duty. And not just any duty, but a sacred one. For the Stoic, duty is not reserved for soldiers or philosophers. It belongs to everyone who chooses to show up with intention. It is the way you carry yourself in the smallest acts, the way you treat others in silence, the way you perform even unnoticed work as if the gods themselves are watching. Ethan reminded himself of that truth every time he sat down to work. He no longer coded just to deliver a product. He designed as an act of service. The user on the other end wasn't a data point or a persona. They were a person recovering from trauma, regaining independence through technology that Ethan was building with his own hands. That realization shifted everything. Frustration turned into fuel. Delays became opportunities for refinement. Feedback, even when harsh, was no longer a blow to his ego, but a sharpening of his craft. Before each work session, he paused for 30 seconds. This had become his small ritual. He would close his eyes and silently repeat a phrase. I build with virtue. I design with care. I contribute with intention. Then, and only then, would he begin. This brief moment reset his posture from performer to servant. It made his work not smaller, but more profound. He also began a new habit that surprised even him. At the end of each project milestone, instead of checking off a task or updating a tracker, he would open a personal log and write a short reflection, not on what he did, but on what it meant. Today, he had refined the app's on flow to make it easier for users with visual impairments. In his log, he wrote, improved font contrast and voice prompts. This could help someone feel less afraid of using a phone again. This is good work. It was a small line, but it grounded him. It reminded him that labor, when aligned with purpose, becomes sacred. There's a dangerous lie in modern work culture that says only loud success matters. That if your work doesn't go viral, or become profitable, or gather praise, then it is meaningless. But Ethan had begun to see through that illusion. He realized the Stoics never measured worth by outcome. They measured it by effort, by integrity, by how much of yourself you brought to what you did regardless of who noticed. This mindset liberated him. He no longer craved validation. He didn't design for applause. He designed with discipline, and that gave him peace. Not every day was easy. Some days, The design was frustrating. Progress was slow. Feedback was unclear. But in those moments, he would return to the core question: what am I really doing here? He wasn't just moving pixels. He was removing friction. He was translating confusion into clarity. He was helping someone heal. He kept a photograph on his desk. It wasn't of Rome or of his family. It was of an elderly woman holding a smartphone and smiling. It had been taken during early usability testing. She had suffered a minor stroke and had never used a mobile app before. When she succeeded in completing her first guided exercise, she beamed. That smile reminded Ethan of why he showed up. Because work, real work, is not just a means to survive. It is the forge where character is tested and tempered. It is where patience, precision, and perseverance meet. And when approached with intention, it becomes a daily offering of virtue. As the clock moved closer to 4 and the Roman light began to shift into a softer glow, Ethan paused. He looked at what he had created that day. It wasn't perfect, but it was thoughtful. It was clear. It was useful. And most of all, it was built with care. He didn't need a reward to feel fulfilled. His reward was in the effort itself. Because when you approach your work as a Stoic, what you create is more than output. It becomes a reflection of who you are. Quiet, consistent, committed, and that is a craft worth honoring. By noon, the Roman sun had risen high enough to bleach the buildings with gold. The city pulsed with its usual midday rhythm. Tourists gathered in flocks, scooters buzzed past ancient walls, and somewhere in the distance, a street musician began to play Vivaldi on a worn violin. Ethan stepped away from his desk and closed his laptop slowly, deliberately. It wasn't about taking a break. It was about stepping into presence. He slipped on his shoes and left his apartment with nothing but his wallet, a pen, and a notebook small enough to fit in his jacket pocket. No phone. That was intentional. He knew the difference between pausing and disconnecting. One refreshes, the other numbs. This wasn't escape. This was a return. He walked through the twisting alleys of Rome, following instinct rather than schedule. His destination wasn't a place. It was a posture, a way of being. But soon enough, the Spanish steps emerged ahead of him, rising like a marble wave frozen in time. He had come here before, but today felt different. He sat midway on the steps, between a group of chattering students and a silent couple holding hands. He pulled out the notebook and wrote one word at the top of the page: breathe. He looked around. No screens, no alerts, no metrics, only motion, sound, and sensation. The warmth of the stone beneath him, the distant laughter of children, the smell of fresh basil wafting from a nearby cafe. He felt no urge to capture the moment. The moment was enough. This pause was not a reward for hard work. It was part of the work, a midday audit of awareness, a recalibration of purpose, a chance to zoom out from tasks and remember the texture of being alive. The Stoics taught that the mind is constantly at war with distraction, that clarity is a discipline, not a default. In this age, distraction comes in the form of feeds, flashes, and fabricated urgency. But clarity requires stillness, attention, courage to stop. Ethan practiced what he called solitude in motion, a mindful walk without agenda. It sharpened him. Ideas often surfaced not in front of a screen, but in silence. Questions he hadn't thought to ask earlier now rose like bubbles in a quiet lake. Am I making space for what matters? Am I moving with intention or momentum? Am I building or just reacting? He didn't need answers right away. The act of asking was enough. The questions cleared the fog. They made him feel less mechanical, more human. After a while, he made his way to a small family-run panini shop just off the main square. He ordered roasted vegetables with pecorino and fresh oregano and sat outside at a quiet table in the shade. He called it his analogue lunch. No scrolling, no multitasking, just food, flavor, and reflection. He chewed slowly, not because of discipline, but because he finally noticed what hunger felt like. He drank water like it meant something. He watched the people around him not as distractions, but as scenes in a living painting. The old man in the gray blazer petting a stray dog, the teenager sketching shoes in a notebook, the chef on his smoke break looking at the sky instead of his phone. He thought about how the world urges us to keep producing, keep pushing, keep proving, but not once does it remind us to pause, to absorb, to remember we're not machines, we're architects of experience, and no structure can stand without spaces between the walls. As he finished the last bite, he felt something unexpected, not energy in the usual sense, but a groundedness, a soft strength, like a house after the storm shutters have been opened again. He didn't feel rushed to return to work. He felt ready, not because he had escaped responsibility, but because he had remembered why it mattered. He walked back slowly, retracing steps not out of efficiency, but out of familiarity. The city felt slower, but it was Ethan who had changed. The noise hadn't decreased. His awareness had expanded when he finally reopened his laptop. The day wasn't divided into two halves anymore. It was one continuous line, sharpened by reflection, elevated by presence. He didn't see his afternoon tasks as burdens. He saw them as opportunities to reapply what the pause had given him. He understood now that mindfulness is not an event. It's a thread, one you weave through your day, not just in the morning or before sleep, but especially when the world expects you to keep running. The power of pause lies in what it reveals, not in what it stops, but in what it allows. And sometimes, sitting on an old marble step, notebook in hand, sandwich half eaten, you remember that being alive is not about doing more. It's about seeing more, feeling more, choosing more. And when you return not just to your work, but to yourself. The sky over Rome softened into a palette of dusty oranges and faint purples. The din of traffic dimmed, replaced by the distant echoes of footsteps, laughter, and plates clinking from open-air trattorias. Ethan closed the lid of his laptop gently, the soft click marking the end of his working day, but not the end of his practice. For him, the true work began now. He stood for a moment at his balcony, watching the city surrender to the night. The breeze carried the scent of stone and lavender, and the rooftops glowed in the afterlight of the sun's departure. He breathed in and asked himself, not out loud but clearly enough to hear within, how did I live today? It was a question he asked daily, not as judgment, but as guidance. There was no performance here, no need to impress anyone. It was an audit of character, done in silence, under the honest light of reflection. Inside, he lit a small candle and sat at his desk with his leather-bound journal. This moment was sacred. It was quiet, but never empty. It was his way of ending the day with clarity rather than collapse. He opened to a fresh page and wrote the date at the top. Then, with slow care, he began to shape the sculpture of his day. What? Did I do well? He paused. I responded to criticism without ego. I stayed present during my afternoon sprint. I remembered to be kind in a conversation that could have gone tense. Where did I fall short? Another pause. I rushed a decision because I feared missing a deadline. I distracted myself with minor tasks instead of facing the one that mattered. I felt envy briefly when I saw someone's launch announcement online. What can I learn from that? I need to trust the long road more. I need to catch the feeling before it defines my action. I need to remember that someone else's win isn't my loss. Each line carved deeper into the structure of his self-awareness. He didn't write to feel better. He wrote to see better. That was the difference. He was no longer interested in comfort. He wanted clarity. He then moved to a practice that had become central to his evening reflections. He rated his behavior against the 4 Stoic virtues: wisdom, courage, justice, and temperance. It wasn't about getting a perfect score. It was about noticing the gaps between who he had been and who he was becoming. Wisdom, 7 out of 10. I made decisions rooted in principle, but I let impatience cloud my judgment in one moment. Courage, 6 out of 10. I avoided a necessary conversation I had planned. Justice, 9 out of 10. I acted with care and fairness, especially during the team sync. Was something powerful in putting numbers to the abstract. It made the philosophical personal. It gave him a way to track not just what he did, but who he was becoming. This wasn't about guilt. It was about growth. Every night was an opportunity to get honest, not to punish himself, but to prepare for a better attempt tomorrow. As the candle flickered low, Ethan leaned back and stared at the ceiling. He felt the weight of the day slowly leave his shoulders. He didn't feel pride in the traditional sense. He felt something more grounded, a calm satisfaction that he had shown up with effort, that he had noticed his missteps, and that he had not allowed them to harden into patterns. He thought of the Stoic metaphor of life as sculpture. Each day, a chisel. Each action, a strike. We are always shaping something, either with awareness or by accident. Reflection, to Ethan, was the moment to look at the shape forming under his hands and ask, is this who I meant to become? He took one last glance at his notes, then closed the journal. No drama, no grand insight. Just a quiet peace, earned by observation. The kind of peace that doesn't announce itself, but settles in the chest and makes sleep come softer. From the window, Rome exhaled with him. He could see the shadows stretched long across the cobblestones. The lanterns flickered to life one by one. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new choices, and new chisels. But tonight, with nothing left to prove, he had only one duty left: to rest the tools. Night had fully arrived. Rome had quieted to a low hum, and from Ethan's window, the world looked smaller, softer. Lamplight flickered against cobblestones worn smooth by centuries of footsteps, and the cool night air carried a sense of stillness rarely felt during the day. Ethan moved slowly through his apartment, as if the weight of the day deserved a softer kind of movement. It was late, but he wasn't rushing to sleep. This hour, for him, had become something sacred, a final checkpoint. Not a review of what was, but an anticipation of what could be. He sat at his desk once more, this time not to reflect backward, but to lean gently into the future. He opened a separate notebook, one reserved for a single ritual. It wasn't a to-do list. It wasn't goal setting. It was a practice he had come to call the night before blueprint, a conversation with his future self, written with care and clarity, just a few sentences at a time. If tomorrow were to be lived again and again, would I be proud of how I moved through it? That question sat like a stone in his mind, one he had carried since first encountering the idea of eternal return. The thought wasn't frightening, it was sobering. It pulled the future into the present with an urgency that had nothing to do with pressure. It was presence, amplified. Ethan believed that most people treat tomorrow as disposable, like a draft they'll get to revise. But what if tomorrow was not just a repeat of today, but a loop he had to live over and over without escape? That thought sharpened his decisions. It made him care. He began writing slowly. Tomorrow, speak less quickly. Pause more. Don't rush clarity. It is better to be understood than impressive. Tomorrow, protect the morning. That hour is your compass. Don't trade it for noise. Tomorrow, remember that challenge is not interruption. It is the curriculum. You're here to respond, not retreat. Tomorrow, do the work with reverence. What you build has purpose, even if no one claps. Tomorrow, forgive quickly. Carry less. The words weren't instructions. They were invitations, not demands. Reminders, like a note left for someone you love. Only the recipient was the person you were becoming. He folded the page and placed it on his nightstand. Every Friday, he would send one of these notes to himself through a scheduled email service. They would arrive just before breakfast the following Monday. The timing was intentional. A conversation between who he was at rest and who he needed to be in motion. And each time he read one, it felt like a compass being handed back to him after being slightly lost. This was the unseen part of Ethan's routine, the invisible scaffolding, the quiet architecture beneath the visible day. While most people strategized their calendar, he was designing his character, not with lofty affirmations, but with grounded commitments. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring, he couldn't, but that wasn't the point. Stoicism had never promised certainty. It offered only the chance to prepare, to sharpen your stance before the world required you to take it. Ethan stood by the window again. Rome shimmered with a kind of nocturnal humility. The city, once loud and relentless, now whispered in shadows and golden glows. He looked out, not to observe, but to feel small in the best way, like one drop in something vast. A part of the flow, not separate from it. He thought of a line from Epictetus. First, say to yourself what you would be, and then do what you have to do. The sentence struck him differently now, not as instruction, but as invitation. Be who you've designed yourself to be. No more waiting. He turned from the window and lay in bed, but sleep didn't come immediately, and that was fine, because what filled the space before rest wasn't worry or noise. It was a quiet confidence that even if nothing extraordinary happened tomorrow, he could still live it with dignity. He had already rehearsed the hard parts. He had already written the story. All that remained was to walk it with awareness, and so he closed his eyes, not to escape the day, but to prepare for the return of it, knowing that each new dawn was a gift, not to be endured, but to be built, intentionally, consciously, repeatedly. Not a performance, a practice. When we first met Ethan, he wasn't lost in the dramatic sense. He wasn't spiraling or crashing or running from something obvious. In fact, that's what made his story so familiar. He was functioning, succeeding even, working in a vibrant city, living in Rome, surrounded by beauty and history. But something essential was missing. He was moving through his days without truly inhabiting them, and maybe that's why his story hits so close to home, because how many of us live like that? Achieving on paper but hollow in practice, rushing from morning to meeting to inbox to evening, yet never stopping to ask, what am I actually building here? Ethan's transformation didn't begin with a breakdown. It began with a decision. One morning, as sunlight crept across the Tiber River, he realized his life wasn't just happening yet, was being constructed, brick by brick, with every thought, every reaction, every choice. And from that moment on, he stopped sleepwalking through his schedule and began to architect his day like a Stoic. He didn't aim for control over the world. He aimed for control over himself. We watched as he shaped each part of his day with deliberate care. Mornings became sacred. No more mindless scrolling or rushing. Instead, intention, breathwork, and visualization created a mental blueprint to follow. He welcomed difficulty before it arrived, training his nervous system to respond with calm. Then came the emotional tests, the emails, the pressure, the moments that would have once triggered frustration or panic. But Ethan built a fortress inside himself. He paused. He assessed. He responded from reason, not reactivity. That wasn't perfection. It was power. His work transformed too. What once felt like a checklist became an offering. He began to design, not just with skill, but with soul. The user was no longer a target. They were someone he could serve. He treated even the quiet hours of solo work as meaningful, as sacred duty. Not flashy, but deeply fulfilling. Midday brought pause, not escape. He walked through the Spanish Steps, not to clear his head, but to reconnect it to his body. He chose presence over productivity, silence over stimulation. In a world that pushes constant momentum, he reclaimed stillness as strength, And when the day drew to a close, he didn't collapse into sleep. He reflected. He sculpted the day in hindsight, examining each action under the light of virtue. He didn't punish himself. He refined himself. Through questions, ratings, and radical honesty, he tracked not his performance, but his growth. But perhaps the most powerful piece was his nightly ritual, sitting in the dark, not recapping what had happened, but rehearsing what might. Writing messages to his future self, he lived tomorrow before it came. He chose in advance who he wanted to be, so that when the world demanded a reaction, he could respond with grace. Ethan's life didn't explode into something new. It evolved, slowly, quietly, powerfully, and through it all, what he was really building wasn't a perfect day. It was a resilient identity, because a Stoic day isn't about winning every moment. It's about showing up to each one with clarity, composure, and character. So what can we learn from Ethan? First, that discipline is freedom. That routines are not cages, but foundations. When we take time to create structure, to set intention, to pause and reflect, we stop being victims of circumstance and become architects of our own lives. Second, that our emotional responses are not fixed. We are not stuck with our temper, our anxiety, our reactivity. With practice, we can learn to pause, to breathe, and to choose differently. This doesn't make us robotic. It makes us sovereign. Third, that our work can be sacred, no matter what it is. Whether you're coding, cooking, leading, or learning, you can do it with virtue. You can embed your effort with meaning. The world doesn't need louder people. It needs present ones. And finally, that preparation is peace. The way we end each day, the way we forecast the next, can change the way we live. If you had to live tomorrow on repeat forever, would you prepare for it differently? That's the question that changes everything. Ethan's story isn't rare because of some superhuman trait. It's rare because he chose to see, to slow down, to step forward with intention. And you can too. So now I want to hear from you. What part of Ethan's journey resonated with you the most? Was it his morning routine, his emotional pause, the way he reframed work, or how he prepared for the day ahead? Share your answer in the comments so others can reflect too. And if you found this story meaningful, take a moment to subscribe to the channel. It helps us bring more stories like this to life, rooted in ancient wisdom, built for modern minds. This is not just content. This is a movement of people learning to live with depth, clarity, and courage. So hit subscribe, and let's keep building together.